Hey everybody, it's Kevin Lau here. I'm your host of the Planning for Retirement podcast, and today I'm super excited to break down Volume 2 of the Whiteboard Retirement Plan. If you missed the first volume of our Whiteboard Retirement Plan, go back and check out episode 49. It's a super cool concept that I'm excited to continue to go down. And the first one we did on the actual whiteboard. Today I'm going to be doing it on my iPad based on feedback that I've received from you all that sometimes of course, my handwriting is not super eligible, but in terms of the colors popping on the whiteboard was a little difficult to see. So today we're going to be doing it on the iPad. It's essentially our version of the back of the napkin calculation for, hey, someone submits their information, they share a little bit of data with us about their financial situation, and anonymously we'll break down our thoughts on their retirement plan and how they are tracking for their goals. Now, as always, this is not advice. This is purely educational, and it's sort of getting inside of my brain. I've been doing this for over 16 years now, helping people transition to retirement. So getting inside my brain on how I might approach this if I were in their shoes. And super excited about this case because it's a married couple, 58 and 54, that are transitioning to retirement after sending their kids to college. You know, basically they have 3 kids, ages 21, 18, and 17. And so they're kind of right in the middle of getting their kids off to college, becoming an empty nester, and finding their new identity and sort of transitioning to retirement. And so it's very relevant because literally we just had Jeff McDermott on episode 52 talking about the sandwich generation, paying for college, planning for their own retirement, and even caring for aging parents. So a lot of those concepts that Jeff and I talked about on episode 52, we're going to weave into this whiteboard retirement plan breakdown. So if you're finding value in what we're doing here, as always, make sure to follow our show, make sure to share it with a friend or colleague, and make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. Okay. Most of our listeners are on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, kind of split right in the middle even, which is great. But all the video content, we're posting that on Spotify. We're posting that on YouTube. So make sure to follow those. But on YouTube, we've got a little special playlist in there called the Whiteboard Fireside Chats. And that's where twice a week I break down some of the concepts that we talk about on the podcast, or I see you in my practice on a day-to-day basis. Because at the end of the day, I am a practicing financial planner. I'm not a professional podcaster that's out there. You know, I'm not Joe Rogan here. You know, I'm just a guy. I'm just a financial planner who loves this stuff. And I've been living this for the last 16 years. And so I want to just share my knowledge, share my insights. And from what I've learned, helping people transition into retirement successfully, what you should know as you're 55, 60, 65 years old and transitioning to retirement. So without further ado, why don't we jump into this case? So I've got the whiteboard up here, and hopefully this is nice and clear for y'all. So as you can tell, the title up here, I called it is Coast to Retirement. Right now, like I said, they're age 58 and 54. And then the second part is, and make a multi-generational impact. And so you'll see why in just a little bit. I was trying to figure out some really creative names here, and I literally was drawing a blank, but I was like, hey, what's a really famous couple right now? And immediately I gravitated to, of course, Travis Kelce and Tay Tay. All right. So that's going to be our couple today. So we've got Travis, who's 58, and Taylor, who's 54. And they have 3 children, as I already mentioned, ages 21, 18, and 17. And so I'm going to assume the 21-year-old is in the middle of college now, and the 18-year-old is either a freshman or maybe transitioning to college next year, and then the 17-year-old right after. So first of all, God bless you. At one point, you probably had 3 kids under the age of 4. Or at least 3 kids under the age of 5, depending on those birth dates. And so as someone who's kind of in the thick of that right now, I am looking forward to, coming out on hopefully successfully on your end, where you're at this point where you're now thinking about becoming an empty nester, getting your kids out of the house, getting them, into society and sort of becoming a contributing member to society. So that's probably what your main priority is right now. But this couple has been doing very, very well. They're high earners. They're high achievers, obviously. Their total income roughly is $425,000. And that is combined. I'm not sure what the split is. If Travis is making the money or Taylor's making the money, I'm going to just assume Tay Tay's, the sugar mama. So I'm assuming she's making the lion's share of that 425, right? But we have this total income of 425. So I'm going to assume that they've had very demanding jobs for years, okay, for decades. And so if we've got this $425,000 income, you're also going to assume that they've accumulated a substantial amount of assets, hopefully if they've been disciplined savers. And that is absolutely true. And we're going to transition it over to the balance sheet. So they've saved roughly 5.5 million, and I kind of rounded up and down. So, I just wanted to work with nice even numbers. So roughly $5.5 million total investable assets. And I've broken their balance sheet down into three different types of assets. We've got the taxable bucket here. We've got the tax deferred bucket here. And then we've got the tax free bucket here. Okay. So in the taxable bucket, bank accounts, brokerage accounts, treasury bonds. I'm going to assume those are probably I bonds that were purchased in 21, 22 when inflation was nearing 9%. And then so that totals about 510,000. So great job building up some additional savings outside of the traditional qualified plans. That tells me that they have been good savers for quite a while. They've been max funding their 401ks, max funding their IRAs, and they're still saving in excess over and above what those max contributions are. But the lion's share of their assets are in these tax deferred vehicles. Okay. So we've got a traditional 401k of 250. We've got a traditional IRA of 2.5 million. And we've got another IRA, and that's Tay-Tay. So by the way, Tay-Tay's in blue, Travis is in gray. And so total tax deferred assets, about $4.25 million. Great job on this one, by the way. If you've been following my podcast for a while, or if you've listened to what I've said about tax deductible versus after tax or tax free contributions, I actually did a whiteboard fireside chat exactly on this topic. Should you contribute to a pre-tax or a post-tax IRA or 401k? And this couple is a perfect example of contributing to the pre-tax contributions because that income is fairly high, in excess of $400,000 a year. And so they are in the higher income tax bracket. So getting a tax deduction now and deferring those gains, deferring that income until later on when they retire, which their hope is when Travis is 65 and when Taylor is 61, that's their goal. So at that point in time, their income is going to most likely go down substantially. And at that point in time as well, we can then consider the idea of Roth conversions, okay? Especially if they're going to delay Social Security, let's say until age 70, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here. And then the final bucket that they've saved money into, which they've done a phenomenal job with, is the tax-free bucket. They've got a Roth 401k, which I love that, $250,000 there. Roth IRA, $30,000 there. Roth IRA for Tay-Tay, $12,000. And then they've got these 3 529s, a total of $395K. All right. So like I mentioned, this is where they're at right now. They're most likely thinking about this bucket as the next asset they're going to start tapping into during the next few years of paying for college. 3 kids in college. Again, God bless you. So we're going to be in the same boat too. And, I don't even know how many years, 13 to 14 years. So anyways, we've got these 3 529s, $395,000, and they've also built up a nice little chunk in the HSA. So $60,000. The one thing I would say there is, if you can swing it, try not to tap into your HSA right now for medical bills. I know, raising 3 kids, probably went to the ER a bunch of times, probably had a bunch of doctor's visits, etc. But hopefully, if you can let that HSA cook and compound, that could be a tax-free vehicle you continue to let grow for your retirement. Now, what I'd say is, don't just let that asset just sit around. I've seen that happen a lot of times where clients just get so emotionally connected to this HSA balance. Like, oh, I love seeing this thing grow. Now it's $200,000. And I'm like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Klein, you're 75. When are you planning to spend that down? They're like, oh, well, I guess I should start doing that now. I'm like, yeah, you have $200,000 in this HSA. You need to start spending this down, because immediately when you transition that asset to the next generation, that's going to be the taxable event to them. Okay. There's no sort of stretch HSA rule out there, at least that I know of. Of course, if you leave an HSA to your spouse, so if Travis passed away and it was his HSA, it leaves it to Taylor, she's fine. But ultimately, if you leave this asset to your kids, it's going to create a tax bomb right then and there. So spend that down during your retirement, but try not to tap that early. If you can, again, pay for your medical expenses out of pocket, this HSA is super powerful. Now, with that being said, don't just let that HSA sit around in cash, because a lot of times the default option when you're contributing to an HSA is the money just sits in cash and goes into the sweep account and doesn't get invested. All right. So anyways, all right. So I would say that the big thing for them is, they, like I said, they're 58 and 54, and they're looking to transition to retire in about 7 years. The first thing I'd recommend for them is not even financial related. It's just sort of thinking about what their purpose is going to be in retirement. What's going to get them out of bed every morning? That's going to be a really important process to figure that out. It's not going to happen overnight. I promise you that. Okay. Typically it takes several years, especially you're in this phase of, being in the trenches, 3 kids in college at the same time. It's going to take a little while once you do become an empty nester, once those kids are off to college and now you've got some peace and quiet in the house, you're like, hey, what's going on? Let's reconnect here, Travis and Tay. Let's reconnect here. Let's go out on some dates. Let's let's dream a little bit about what we want our future to look like during our golden years, during that go year of retirement. And this couple had mentioned a little bit about international travel during that 10 years. And so from 65, down to 75 and 71, they really want to go aggressive with traveling, which is great. I love to hear that. And oftentimes people get this wrong. They sort of think through retirement income and they sort of think about this, static spending throughout retirement and just adjusting with inflation each and every year. That's not reality. Generally speaking, this couple, high demanding jobs for decades. And then all of a sudden they retire at 65 and 61. And now every day is Saturday. They're going to have a lot more free time to do the things they want to do, like travel. So what I oftentimes see is in the beginning phase of retirement during those go years, my clients tend to actually increase their spending a little bit more because those discretionary expenses go up. And then at some point, they're like, man, I've checked off all the bucket lists. I've hit those, big international trips that I've wanted to go. Now I'm going to, and also it's just tiring. It's exhausting traveling in general, let alone traveling overseas. And then they may start to slow it down at some point in time. Now it's different for everybody. I have some clients that are in their 80s that are still they're kind of in the go year still. And then I have clients in their early 70s that are already in the no-go years. They're not going anywhere. And oftentimes it's because some sort of physical limitation. So one of the other things that I'm thinking about with Travis and Taylor is, and that's why I call this thing Coast Fire, is you've done a great job saving to get to this point. And I'm not going to suggest you retire today because that might be a little risky. And I don't know how much you're spending of that 425. Because if we just did a quick little back of the napkin calculation and we said, okay, let's use the 4% rule, which, I'm not a fan of just using the 4% rule it's a benchmark, not a rule. But if we just use the 4% rule and we multiply that into $5.5 million, that's about $220,000 that they could comfortably spin off and have a very low risk of ever running out of money, at least before 30 years. So I'm not saying retire now, but you sort of teed yourself up to where that's a pretty nice income. That's not, I'm not going to say guaranteed, but that's a very stable, very high probability of achieving for the next several decades. And so I guess what I'm saying is you could be in a position where, hey, you know what, maybe I revisit my current job. Maybe my job, I don't really love what I'm doing. It's been a grind and it's been a blessing. You've been able to get to this point. You're paying for your kids' college. You've got a nice little chunk saved for retirement. Maybe you can do something different for a few years that's a little bit less demanding on your time and maybe start to do some of those things that you wanted to do in retirement now. Okay. Because health is not guaranteed at 65, 61. Okay. So if there are some bucket list trips, you're like, I've always wanted to do that. You've got the capacity to do so. And what I haven't mentioned yet is this couple is also max funding these retirement plans still. So they're max funding a 401k, which is in excess of $30,000 a year. They're max funding an HSA, which is in excess of $9,000 a year. Okay, so right there, we've got about $40,000, and they also mentioned they're saving into 529s in the brokerage accounts. So this client is autopilot in terms of savings. Maybe what they can think of is, hey, we've already saved a good chunk. Maybe we can redirect that savings. We can take that off the table and reduce our income because we don't need to save anymore for retirement, and we can essentially coast to retirement or redirect those dollars from their current jobs. Maybe they love what they do and use that for traveling now, okay, as opposed to waiting until 65. So instead of max funding a 401k with 30K, maybe you take that 30K, pay the taxes on it, and go take an amazing trip with all of your kids, okay? Those are some of the things that I'd be thinking about, sort of when this die with zero concept of this utility of money goes down as you age. At 80, I'm telling you, I have 80-year-old clients. They're not going anywhere. I'm going to their kitchen table and having conversations about, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Klein, your portfolio made $250,000 last year. What are you going to do with all that money? And they're thinking, I don't want to do anything. I'm like, they're going to give it to their kids. And so that's another thing is this couple, Travis and Taylor, also talked about this idea of giving financial legacy, giving during lifetime as opposed to giving during death. So I love that concept, and we're going to hit on that as well. But right away with the 4% rule, we've got a nice little baseline of possibilities. If they did want to retire before 65 or 61, they have that capacity to do so. Now, the earlier they retire, the longer potential bridge they would have until Social Security kicks in, which that's going to be a conversation we'll have in just a moment, is when they start claiming Social Security. But we're going to start first with college because I've got some thoughts on that one. Like I mentioned, they have $395,000 in 529 plans. Phenomenal. All right. And, I just did a quick little Google search on this one and, try to pre-populate this data here for the sake of time. But a four-year public school in state on average is going to be about $28,000 on an annual basis. So if you multiply that by 4, I already know, one of the children is already in college. So I don't know how many years he or she has left, but I'm just going to, just for easy numbers, let's multiply that by 4. That's $112,000 per kid. And if you multiply it by 3 kids, that gives you $336,000 that they would need to essentially fully fund public school for 3 kids. All right. Public school in state. Now, we already know one of the kids is already in college. All right. And so, we've got this money in a 529 that really could cover all of those expenses if they wanted to and have some money left over, just under $60K, about $59,000 in leftover dollars. So that's another option. Okay. This idea of Coast Fire, where you've set yourself up with a nice baseline of retirement assets, maybe instead of tapping into your 529 accounts, okay, this is just me spitballing here, maybe instead of tapping into your 529 accounts, maybe you just redirect some of those dollars that are in excess that you're already saving into your 401k, saving into those brokerage accounts, saving into your 529s, maybe the HSA, I'd keep that rolling. And maybe the 401k, maybe you contribute up to the matching contribution because that's free money. But instead of max funding the 401k, maybe you take some of those dollars off the table and just write the checks directly to those institutions. Because what that's going to do is that's going to protect and preserve these 529 plans. And what we know with the Secure Act 2.0 is that these 529 plans can be a multi-generational legacy tool now. All right. Even before Secure Act 2.0, you could always change beneficiaries of the 529. So let's say your 21-year-old got through school and she still has $150,000 left in his or her 529 plan. Well, you could always change the beneficiary later on. You don't have to do it today. You can let that money sit in the 529 and continue to grow tax-free. And then you could change that beneficiary to their children down the road. Multi-generational impact, okay? Unlike the Coverdale ESAs back in the day when you had to empty those accounts by 30, 529s, there are no rules there. And you could change the beneficiary to anyone you'd like. So again, I'd think through that because maybe you have an opportunity to take current income that you're directing towards retirement that you may or may not need yet. This money in a 529, this is so powerful. This could pay for college for multiple generations to come potentially if you preserve that asset. So certainly you could dip into this account and pay for some schooling now, but maybe there is a play where you leave some of those dollars in this 529 account and either look at changing the beneficiaries or doing the Roth IRA rollover, which I'm going to do a little whiteboard fireside chat on that sometime probably next week or the week after. So stay tuned for that one. But there are some special rules with this 529 to Roth IRA rollover that many of you want to consider, especially Travis and Taylor, who have done a really, really good job saving for college. Okay. So anyways, that's just my thoughts about college funding is that they've done a phenomenal job building up to the 529. But if they're going to stay working and they've built a nice baseline for retirement, there could be an opportunity to redirect some of those dollars instead of burning through these 529 accounts, using that current income to pay for college out of pocket and continue to let that tax-free growth compound on the 529 accounts. All right, guys, here's the meat and potato of the initial phase of retirement here. All right, so what I did is I just did a quick little investment calculator, and I took their current assets between the taxable bucket, tax-deferred, tax-free bucket, and I just assumed no more contributions into those accounts. I wanted to be super conservative because the other side of the equation is what's the expected annual return, which we assumed 6%. So even though that assumption is probably pretty accurate because they did indicate that they are comfortable with being more aggressive. Okay. So an aggressive investor to me, most likely is 80% or higher in the stock market. And if you're 80% or higher in the stock market, 6% is probably a pretty conservative assumption for rate of return. But I wanted to be conservative with that one because I just don't know exactly what their working scenario is going to be. Are they going to continue to work until 65 in the same capacity? Will they sort of think through this idea of paying some of those college expenses out of pocket as opposed to burning through the 529? I don't know. Never had a conversation with them, but either way, I wanted to be super conservative with the rate of return and the additional savings going in. So if no dollars were saved on top of what they currently have, Okay, so they stopped contributing to everything and they just had 6% compounding. Here's what their portfolio is going to look like by the time they're 65 and 61. About 7.7 million. That's the power of compounding. That's why I mentioned this idea of coast fire, because they could sort of say, hey, you know what? We've been grinding for the last 30 plus years. We've been sacrificing a lot. We've been saving a lot of our income. Let's enjoy this last 10 years while the kids are still in the house for the next couple of years, or still in college for the next few years. And they're still coming back to the house before they go out and start their own lives and settle down, get married, start their careers and have kids. Enjoy this time now. And so they could coast to retirement. So 7.7 million at the age of 65 and 61. Let's do the 4% rule on that one, just for fun. Okay, so if we took the 4% rule on that, that's approximately $308,000. Again, and this is before ignoring taxes. So what I would tell you, Travis and Tay, is that if you tapped in 4% of your portfolio, if you did the 4% rule, okay, which if you're not familiar with the 4% rule, that's okay. I did a whiteboard fireside chat on my YouTube about this. What was the title? I think it was called, What is a Safe Rate of Withdrawal, or what's a safe withdrawal rate? And I broke down the 4% rule, which is, it's essentially the benchmark that everyone uses that specializes in retirement planning in terms of withdrawal rates. But there are some limitations and challenges of that, one of which is that it ignores any other cash flows from things like Social Security or pension. And we know Travis and Taylor, with their high incomes, they're going to have a Social Security benefit. So, but $308,000 is what I tell them is, hey, you can sustain that as a starting withdrawal rate and adjust that inflation for as long as you live. And you have a very low likelihood of ever burning through your assets before 30 years. And more likely, that portfolio is going to be multi-generational. Okay. So if you are comfortable with $308,000 before taxes to sustain your lifestyle, you can absolutely coast fire. If you say, hey, you know what, Kevin, that's a little bit low. We actually need closer to 350 or 360. That's okay. I mean, let's look at that. Let's take a look at 350. Divide that into 7,700. That's only a 4.5% rate of withdrawal. Even if we took your full salary, let's take your full salary, total compensation, 425. You say, you know what, conservatively, we have no idea how much we're going to spend. Let's just figure, hey, 5.5% starting withdrawal rate, assuming you just took your whole salary, 425, and you never wanted to skip a beat. I'm assuming that's not right because, again, you're saving for retirement, you're saving for college already, so most likely not all of that's going to lifestyle. But 5.5% rate of withdrawal, that does not concern me at all because I know at some point Social Security is going to kick in. Okay, Social Security is going to kick in potentially here. This actually should be 67 at full retirement age for Taylor. But anyways, this is why I highlighted age 70 here, because this is when Travis would be eligible for his Social Security, which is latest retirement age. Call it LRA, latest retirement age. This would be his max benefit. Now, of course, he could take it early. I mean, he could take it as early as 62 if he wanted. But because of the assets that they've accumulated and because one of their concerns was longevity and was inflation, this annuity, Social Security, is the best inflation and longevity protector we have, okay, or that you have. And so let's maximize that. So one way you can maximize this is instead of taking it as early as possible at age 62, maybe taking it at your full retirement age at 67, or better yet, delaying the higher benefit until 70. And the higher benefit in this case is Travis. And so if Travis delayed until 70, his benefit is going to be, we'll call it 50, what did we say? About $58,000 per year. Okay. And let's say Taylor, let's say she took hers that same year. So her full retirement age benefit is about $33,000. So let's take a haircut off of that. Let's call it $30K. Okay, so let's say she gets $30K from her Social Security. Let's make that a different color. So Social Security for her is about $30K. Okay, so that's a total of $88,000 they're going to receive from Social Security before taxes if they were to wait until that year. But again, we've got a bridge. We've got about a 5-year period until we get there. So that's going to be a nice annuity that they could potentially delay. And I'm not saying they should delay until 70. But what I'm saying is if they have longevity in their family, if they have longevity concerns and inflation concerns, that's a consideration, is to at least delay the higher benefit, which is Travis's, to 70 to maximize that one for two reasons. Number one, it's going to give them the highest bang for their buck. But then number two, if Travis were to predecease Taylor, Taylor will step up to Travis's benefit with the survivor benefits. And so that's a way to maximize those survivor benefits to the surviving spouse. But if they were retired at 65, we're going to have this basically 5-year period where they need to bridge income. And what I just mentioned, in terms of safe rates of withdrawal, they could replace their entire salary, $425,000, and do that for a few years. That's only a 5.5% rate of withdrawal. And let's say their portfolio dips down a little bit because of that. Let's say they weren't earning 5.5% on their portfolio. They were earning a little bit less than that. And so maybe their portfolio really, really conservatively went down to $700,000. And again, we're ignoring inflation and those types of factors. But let's say now, instead of needing $425,000 to be super, super conservative, we subtract out Social Security of $88K. Now they only need $337. Let's divide that by 7 million. Now we're down to a 4.8% rate of withdrawal at that point in time. And again, that assumes they're replacing their entire salary, which I just know that's not going to be their spending need. It's going to be significantly less. So that's what I'm talking about. Coast fire. You've done a great job saving to this point. You have the option. I'm not telling you to stop saving for retirement, but you have the option to maybe take some of those dollars and instead of redirecting for your own retirement, because you've already built to such a great baseline, maybe funding college out of pocket, maybe taking some trips and spending those dollars today as opposed to delaying that enjoyment in retirement years, because you just can't guarantee your health is going to be Superman, Superwoman for the next 7 years. Okay. But the bridge is going to be relevant, and that will also factor in when they start Social Security, because if they're very uncomfortable, let's say at 65, or maybe even they retire earlier, and they're like, man, to spin off $300,000 or $400,000 of income just for my assets, it's a little bit uncomfortable, especially because our investments are a little bit more aggressive. Maybe they dial back some of that risk, or maybe they do start Social Security a little bit earlier so they can sort of have that peace of mind where they're not just blowing through their portfolio. There's no one size fits all in terms of an answer on Social Security. But again, if I'm going under the assumption of longevity, living well into your 80s and having some of that risk in the family, it makes a lot of sense to at least delay one of those benefits until 70. But another consideration is to use private annuities. Okay, so we mentioned Social Security is an annuity. You could also look at this idea of bridging the gap of whenever you start retirement until Social Security using some sort of annuity income. All right. And so this annuity income could be for 10 years. It could be for 5 years. It could be for a lifetime. It depends on what you're trying to solve for. But again, this could take some of that concern off the table in terms of, hey, how do I start some kind of paycheck that's not tied to the stock market? And if we're going to delay Social Security, how do we do that? That's inside of a private annuity. Okay, that'd be either a single premium annuity or some sort of deferred income annuity. All right. Now, there are other ways to do this. Okay, there are systematic withdrawals you can have within the portfolio, which we're going to touch on here in just a second. But you could also just tap into systematic withdrawals and sort of say, hey, you know what? I'm going to start with, I'm going to say, hey, let's look at this taxable bucket as our first line of defense. Okay, so sort of this traditional method of thinking of what account do I tap into first? And again, I did a whiteboard fireside chat as well on the YouTube channel. It's called I'm Approaching Retirement. What account do I start drawing from first, or something of that nature? So check that one out. But essentially, the traditional method of thinking is start with the taxable bucket first, then the tax deferred bucket, and then finally the tax-free bucket. So they could essentially just go on this systematic withdrawal strategy and start to withdraw those assets from the taxable account first. Once that's depleted, then they can transition over to the tax deferred account. And at the very end, or legacy, most likely this is going to be for legacy, at least a part of that, not the HSA, but definitely the Roth accounts will be for legacy. Then you can leave those legacy dollars for legacy and essentially have those assets invested more aggressively. All right. So personally, I don't mind the systematic withdrawal. Okay. Do we need an income bridge for 5 years? If they retired at 58 and we had a 12-year window, maybe we have some kind of annuity that pays out for 10 years, or maybe we set up some sort of lifetime income. Again, this kind of depends on the risk tolerance and risk capacity, but I'm totally fine with doing systematic withdrawals from a portfolio as long as there's a disciplined, repeatable process in place. All right. So, but one thing they need to really think about, I highlighted these two ages here, 75 and 71, and then 79, 75. This is when RMDs, required minimum distributions, will kick in. All right. And so for those of you that have been following the podcast for a while, I know you're not going to do this. You're not going to just delay. You're going to take advantage of those early years in retirement when your income goes down, your taxable income goes down, to potentially look at Roth conversion strategies. Okay. But the idea is if they are going to delay Social Security, if their taxable income goes down, remember they've been deferring most of their assets. They've got $6.4 million now in an IRA. Don't wait until 75 to start tapping into those assets. Either look at distributions early in retirement. You don't have to wait until 75 to start taking those distributions. You can start taking them now. And I know this sometimes can go against the traditional method of thinking, which is burn down your taxable assets first, then tap into the tax deferred. But sometimes when we run the numbers, it makes sense to do a pro rata approach where we do an equal withdrawal from the taxable and the tax deferred asset. That could be very viable, okay, for this individual in order to reduce the impact of those RMDs later on. Because once those RMDs start, then there's not a whole lot you can do. Sure, you can do qualified charitable distributions, or maybe you can even do conversions at that point in time. But if you can get ahead of that, if you can do those Roth conversions at those early years of retirement, it's going to serve you much, much better. So be careful of that RMD trap. Look at Roth conversions early on in retirement. Okay. And so for those of you that are not familiar with Roth conversions, you're just taking dollars from a pre-tax account and transitioning them over into a tax-free account. Okay. And you might be thinking, well, who would not want to do that? Well, the downside is you have to pay the taxes now. Okay. So you have to pay the taxes before you can get the money into the tax-free bucket. And so that might be a problem for some of you. Okay. If all of your assets, let's say 100% of your assets are in tax-deferred buckets, and you have no other assets to pay those taxes, that might dip into your principal balance a little bit. Now, I'm not saying it's not a good idea. You just have to run the numbers to say, hey, if I'm going to pay the taxes out of this conversion, how is that going to impact me long term? Okay, based on my long-term strategy, not short-term, but long-term. Because anytime you're paying taxes up front in order to have a benefit long-term, there's going to be a break-even point. Okay, so if you're thinking, hey, you short-sighted over the next 2 to 3 years, what's the best tax strategy? That's not the way to think. Okay? You need to be thinking about lifetime tax impact. Okay, but that's really how you solve for this RMD tax trap. Is you say, let's take advantage of those years when your income goes way down, and then you start this Roth conversion process and fill up a bracket that you're comfortable with. Maybe it's the 22 bracket, maybe it's the 24 bracket, maybe it's the 10 or 12 bracket. Depending on where your income is. Okay, and again, run the numbers, see what makes the most sense. If you don't know what you're doing, talk to a professional that understands retirement income planning that can help you figure out what bracket is optimal to fill up from a Roth conversion standpoint, because there are a variety of options and our tax code's really complicated. It is what it is. And also we have the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sunsetting at the end of 2025. So that's another factor, is that the 22 bracket becomes 25, the 24 bracket becomes 28. So ultimately, if all else stays the same, your taxes for most people will go up starting in 2026. Of course, we've got an election coming up in November, so that's going to impact all of this. But again, avoid that RMD tax trap. And again, I know this couple has been following the podcast for a while. We've interacted before. They understand that they are deferring income for a reason, because they are in a high bracket now. But once they do transition to retirement, that's when I'd start to really think through those RMD tax traps and start to do those Roth conversions. So some of their concerns that they mentioned, bear market, they mentioned a bear market. I think everyone is concerned of bear market and that sequence of return risk, that early, those the beginning of years of retirement. And so one of the things that I'd really get them to think through is this idea of risk tolerance versus risk capacity. So I haven't run the numbers on their full plan long term, but I'm going to I'm going to assume that they probably have options in terms of how much or how little risk that they can take. And they've mentioned that they've been more aggressive, but they also mentioned that if they're on track for their goal, they have no problem with taking some of the risk off the table. That's what risk capacity means. They have the capacity to take on less risk if they so chose. But on the flip side, they could also take on more risk, okay, because they are well funded, so to speak, and because their rate of withdrawal is pretty safe, in my opinion. Then they could also take on more risk and think about long-term life legacy for the next generation and multiple generations to come. So I really get them to think through, what is their risk tolerance? And then how does that impact, how does their ability to fund their retirement income goals and their sort of them being on track, how does that jive with their risk capacity? So should they take on more risk? Should they take on less risk based on the end numbers? So I'd really get them to think through that. But ultimately, the big piece is, if they're going to be relying on portfolio income for withdrawals for the next, let's say that first 5 years of retirement solely before they start Social Security, I'd really think through that bridge from 65 until 70. I make sure that that income is in a very secure spot, okay? Because they don't want to be in a situation where they hit a bear market at the very beginning of retirement and all of a sudden the stocks drop 30 to 40%. They're aggressively invested and now they're thinking, hey, are we even on track anymore? Okay, so one of the ways you can do that, we already talked about the annuitization piece with a private annuity. Another way to do that is using individual bonds or individual CDs and dedicating income with bonds or CDs that mature in that specific year. Okay, and so that's a great strategy. Again, asset dedication is what I would call that. So I would really think through how they can integrate their assets and set that portfolio up for income distributions as those bonds mature in those first 5 years. Then Social Security turns on, then their need for portfolio income goes down. It's still there. Okay, and then you think through, does it make sense for them to add on private annuity income in addition to Social Security? Because their total Social Security is about $100,000. If their total income need, let's say, is $300,000, that's about a third. A third of their income is going to come from stable sources. That might be uncomfortable for them. They may want a little bit more guaranteed fixed income in the portfolio. So maybe they look to annuitize a portion of their assets to maybe get them closer to 50% or 60% of their income. Again, depends on their risk tolerance. It depends on their risk capacity. But with those systematic withdrawals, in addition to, I would also really think through this idea of asset location. All right. So this idea that different buckets are going to be tapped into at different phases of retirement. So the shorter term the bucket, maybe the more conservative that account is versus accounts that are maybe long-term in nature, i.e. the Roth accounts. Maybe those accounts are 100% in stocks because that's going to be legacy for your kids. That's a 40 plus year time horizon. Okay. And so I'd really think through what account is going to be invested which way. And in addition to thinking through taxes, okay, because one of the downsides of going with that method of thinking is that the taxable account is going to be tapped into first. So we're going to load up on safe money, fixed income types of investments. Well, those are interest income, and that's going to be potentially create a tax drag on your portfolio. And so that actually might do more harm than good if you're too conservative with that taxable account. And so maybe it's looking at owning some of those safer assets inside of the tax deferred account, because that's going to be the next line of defense or that next bucket you tap into after the taxable account, and sort of look at that taxable account as a little bit more aggressive just from a tax optimization perspective. But those are some of the things I think through the risk management there. Longevity, we've talked about. I would absolutely really think through this idea of maximizing their Social Security benefit. And that way they get their biggest bang for their buck on those cost of living adjustments, because that does compound with COLA each and every year. Risk of LTC. I mean, this was one of the things that they brought up, the risk of care. And no doubt these clients have the assets to self-fund long-term care. But what I would get them to think through is, does it make sense to redirect some of their income to buying insurance? Okay. And solely for the purpose of, if the first person who needs care, let's say it's Travis, if Travis needed care, Taylor's going to have to step in to care for Travis. Well, even though Taylor might feel like she has enough assets to pay for that care, she might just feel like, I'm just going to do it myself because I just don't know how much longer I'm going to live. I might be 15 years. I might be 20 years. Who knows? And I want to protect and preserve those assets. So therefore, I'm going to just do it myself. And then it's physically taxing. It's mentally taxing. It's emotionally taxing. And all of a sudden that impacts Taylor's longevity, okay, and her quality of life. And then you think through how that might impact their children. If, let's say, Taylor needed care down the road, same kind of story. The kids are going to be stepping in and say, hey, do we burn through our inheritance or do we just take care of mom ourselves? And then who's going to be doing the caregiving? Long-term care insurance eliminates those conversations and says, hey, we have a dedicated pool of funds to hire help, professional help needed. Okay, so I'd really get them to consider thinking through the idea of buying long-term care insurance, specifically to have a pool of assets dedicated to pay for care if they need it. And notice how I said if it, I'm not saying you're going to need it, but if you needed care, how will that impact your loved ones? Because long-term care planning is not about you, it's about your loved ones. And then I'd also get them to think through, again, the sandwich generation that we talked about, their aging parents. They had brought up on a podcast that they heard someone burn through a $2 million portfolio because of a long-term care need. Well, listen, how was your mom and dad? How was their financial situation? If they ever needed care, do they have the assets to pay for that care? And what's their care plan? So that actually might be a conversation that you might want to have with mom or dad to ensure that that doesn't derail your own retirement plans. Because that's one of those unexpected risks that most people don't really think about, is caring for those aging parents and the costs associated with doing so. unless they have a good, sound long-term care plan. I'd also throw another risk in there is the risk of working too long and not being able to enjoy their go-go years. I already talked about that before, but I think this is so common that people just sort of assume that, hey, I'll just work until 65, I'll get Medicare and I'll be good to go. Health can change in an instant. I'm literally going to get on the phone with a client right now whose wife got a diagnosis, and now he's thinking through retiring a little bit earlier. He's had the ability to probably retire 3 years ago, 4 years ago, based on the assets they've saved, but they waited. And now they're in this situation where they're like, hey, man, should we have done that? And again, I don't want to downplay this concern of retiring too early and not having financial independence. But if the math is saying what it is, just go for it. Okay. And that's why I also said, even if you're going to continue to work, start to do some of those things that you want to do in retirement now. That way you're not waiting and sort of betting that health is going to be the same. Last but not least, we talked about this idea of financial legacy, and they're more in tune with this idea of giving with a warm hand versus a cold one. And so I'll just point out this idea that they can do some annual gifting, gift that out of their estate, that $18K a year per beneficiary, per donor. So essentially, Travis and Taylor can give $36K per year to each of their children in 2024 and essentially not have to worry about filing any gift tax return, okay? And so this could be money that they direct to paying for their first home or paying for a wedding or graduate school or making a multi-generational impact. Or maybe when grandkids come into the picture, now you're paying for some of the grandkids' education expenses. And so I really think through this idea that you can make an impact not only by leaving a legacy at death, but also giving during lifetime. And that could also be charitable as well. You know, if they're charitably inclined, we didn't go down this route yet. Typically, when clients are at the beginning phase of retirement, they're sort of, hey, are we okay? And then they're like, man, I have enough, I'm good. Now they start to look at qualified charitable distributions or donor advised funds in order to not only maximize the charities in terms of their benefit, but also maximizing the tax impact to those individuals as well. So what would I do? I would really think through my current occupation and am I having fun? Am I enjoying what I'm doing? And if not, I'd look to really transition to do something else, or maybe start to scale into a phased retirement. Maybe they start working part-time and start to spend a little bit more time with their kids in these college years and these final years that they're kind of still dependent on you, but not really dependent on you. And so really enjoy that time with your family and really start to think through what your purpose is going to be in retirement. Okay, financially, you guys have done a great job. Now you can look at optimizing some of these things as you go along, but you need to get really clear on what you want to do in retirement, where you want to spend your time, where are you going to live? And don't get too caught up in that right away in terms of buying your dream house right away. I would really think through, okay, let's look at some places that we want to live. Let's create a short list of 3 or 4. Let's start to visit those places for a month or 2 months and kind of get a feel for what those places are like, because your kids are going to be off in the real world and they're going to be starting to start their careers and get married and settle down. And that's probably going to impact where you're going to want to live eventually anyway. So don't get too caught up on the housing decision, but I really think through the occupation, starting to enjoy some of that kind of retirement stuff that you were thinking about at 65 and 61. Start to do those things now and start to really enjoy the fruits of your labor, because you guys have worked really, really hard to get to this point. So congratulations on that. Now it's really time to, again, enjoy that hard work that you've put in. Well, that's it for today, everybody. I really hope you found this helpful. I hope you found this Whiteboard Retirement Plan breakdown helpful. If you want to be featured on this, again, fill out the Retirement Readiness Review survey. It's linked in the show notes. Just make sure you indicate it is about the Whiteboard Fireside Chat, okay? Because that's also the same link that people fill out if they're interested in working with me one-on-one, which, of course, if you are interested in working with me one-on-one, fill out that same Retirement Readiness Review, and I will follow up with personalized feedback on a Zoom recording with my thoughts around your plan, okay? And so if you're interested in that, just make sure to go to the show notes, fill out the survey, send it in to us, and we'd be happy to take a look at it. And of course, like the video, share it with a friend or a colleague that's in a similar boat. And make sure to subscribe to our channels so you're keeping up to date with everything we're doing out there. So I hope you guys find value in today. And until next time, this is Kevin Lau signing off.